Welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're kind of going back in time a bit to explore, the lives and perspectives of Black Americans in the decades following the Civil War and emancipation. And we've got some really powerful writing to dig into for this one.
Yeah, it's going to be a good one. And it's not just a history lesson. The ideas we're going to unpack still resonate today, especially when we think about, race, identity, the ongoing pursuit of social justice, all that.
For sure. So we've got two primary sources for this deep dive. First, we'll be looking at the first chapter of W.E.B. Du Bois' book, The Souls of Black Folk, specifically chapter 1. It's called Of Our Spiritual Strivings. And then we're going to look at the Atlanta Compromise speech. This was delivered by Booker T. Washington in 1895. Now, both Du Bois and Washington, these were giants in their time advocating for Black advancement, but they came at it from very different angles.
Yeah, they really did.
Yeah.
And it's those differences that make it so fascinating to kind of, see how their ideas still shape discussions about race in America today.
It's crazy how relevant it still is. But all right, let's dive in with W.E.B. Du Bois. His writing is just so personal, so visceral. You really feel the weight of his words. And he opens up Our Spiritual Strivings with this image of a veil separating him from the white world. And he describes a moment from his childhood when this veil became just starkly clear to him. And he was exchanging visiting cards with other children. This was a pretty common pastime back then. And there was this one girl, a newcomer, and she refused to take his card. Just looked at him and refused.
Wow, it's such a small gesture.
Right.
But for Dubois, it was this profound symbol of division, this otherness. And he goes on to say that this incident sparked this realization of double consciousness in him. So imagine constantly looking at yourself through the eyes of others, measuring your worth by the standards of a world that views you, at best, with pity, And that's what Dubois was describing, this feeling of being both American and Black, but never fully belonging to either identity.
Like two identities battling it out within you. He talks about having two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings. It makes you wonder, have you ever felt like an outsider? Like you're navigating different worlds and trying to figure out where you fit in?
Right. It's something that so many people experience today. But imagine grappling with that feeling while also facing the very real systemic barriers that Black Americans faced after emancipation. And remember, Dubois is writing this in 1903, just a few decades after the end of slavery. And while emancipation was a monumental step, he makes it very clear that it didn't automatically erase centuries of oppression and inequality.
Right. There was still so much work to be done. He goes on to outline the specific challenges that Black Americans were up against. Poverty, limited access to education, lack of resources, and of course, this pervasive prejudice. That cast what he calls a shadow of a vast despair over their lives.
Wow. And it's in this context that he raises this really critical question. He writes, "A people thus handicapped ought not to be asked to race with the world, but rather allowed to give all its time and thought to its own social problems."
He's basically saying, look, you can't expect people to just bounce back from centuries of oppression and then compete on a level playing field. It's like they're starting miles behind, facing all these obstacles, and then they're told to just pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
Exactly. And brings up a bigger question that is still so relevant today. How long does it take for the wounds of the past to truly heal? And what responsibility does the larger society have in facilitating that healing process?
That's a big one. No easy answers there. We'll definitely come back to that later. But for now, let's shift gears a little bit and look at another perspective. We've got Booker T. Washington and his famous Atlanta Compromise speech from 1895.
Yeah, this speech was so influential at the time. It was delivered at the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta. It was a huge event showcasing the progress of the South. And what's fascinating is that Washington's message really resonated with a lot of people, both Black and white, although it wasn't without its controversy, of course.
Oh, absolutely. And he really chose his words carefully. Remember, this is the South in 1895, Segregation is still the law of the land. White supremacy is the dominant ideology. It was a really tense, complex time. And in the midst of all that, Washington steps up and delivers this speech with this incredibly powerful metaphor: cast down your bucket where you are.
Yeah, you can almost hear it echoing, can't you? And those words, they just pack so much meaning. Essentially, he was urging Black Americans to focus on economic self-sufficiency and developing practical vocational skills as a way to move forward.
He was basically saying, look, times are tough. We've got to start where we are. We need to build skills, build businesses, prove our worth. Through hard work, tangible contributions, like there's real dignity in labor. And it can be a path to earning respect and recognition.
And it wasn't just about individual advancement either. Washington also called for racial cooperation
Hmm.
and mutual progress. He used this striking image. He said, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress."
It's a powerful image. He's acknowledging the reality of segregation, while still calling for Black and white Americans to work together for the greater good. But of course, this is the part that sparked a lot of debate. Some people praised him for his pragmatism, while others criticized him for accommodating a system that was inherently unjust.
Right. It was a bold statement, for sure, given the context. And it really gets to the heart of a question we're still wrestling with today. What's the right balance between advocating for social change and focusing on individual advancement within the existing system?
Yeah, it's like, do you work within the system to change it from the inside out? Or do you challenge the system head on, even if it means facing greater resistance? There are no easy answers. Both Dubois and Washington were grappling with these complexities in their own ways. And their ideas, they really continue to shape the conversations we're having today.
Yeah, it is interesting how they both of these figures, Dubois and Washington, they're working towards the same goal of Black advancement. But they had such different ideas about how to actually get there.
Their approaches were very much a reflection of their experiences and perspectives. Like Dubois. Dubois, he was a Harvard-educated scholar, the first Black American to earn a doctorate from the university.
Yeah.
And he really saw education as this powerful tool for dismantling those systems of oppression that kept Black Americans down.
He believed that access to higher education was essential for nurturing Black intellectual leadership and challenging, all those racist narratives that were so deeply ingrained in American society. Yeah, and you see that belief reflected in his writing,
Yeah.
He delves into these complex philosophical ideas. He weaves in historical references. He quotes from literature and poetry. His work is deeply intellectual and thought-provoking. And it's almost like he's trying to break down those barriers of intellectual elitism and demonstrate the brilliance and the capacity of Black thought.
Absolutely. But Washington, on the other hand, he had a much different educational experience. He was born into slavery and later attended the Hampton Institute, a vocational school for Black Americans. And his emphasis was very much on acquiring practical skills like carpentry, agriculture, mechanics, things that would allow Black people to become self-sufficient and contribute to the economy.
Right. He believed that demonstrating their economic value was key to earning respect, and then eventually gaining political and social equality.
So it's like they were tackling the problem from two totally different angles. You've got Dubois, who is focused on dismantling the system from the top down, through intellectual and cultural transformation. And then you have Washington, who is focused on building up from the bottom up through economic empowerment.
Right. It's fascinating to consider how both approaches had their own, strengths and limitations.
Yeah.
For instance, Du Bois's focus on higher education. That was crucial for cultivating future generations of Black leaders and scholars.
Yeah.
But it wasn't necessarily accessible to the masses of Black Americans who were just struggling to survive,
For sure. And then Washington's focus on vocational training. It did provide a lot of Black people with the skills they needed to earn a living, support their families. But some critics argue that it also risked reinforcing the very stereotypes that kept Black Americans confined to certain roles and limited their opportunities.
It's a very delicate balance, isn't it? It really speaks to the complexities of social change. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
No, there really isn't. And then there's the question of political power. Dubois was a strong advocate for Black political participation. He believed that the right to vote and hold office was essential for protecting Black interests and advocating for change.
Absolutely. But this is another area where he and Washington clashed. Washington was much more cautious about pushing for political power. He believed that it was important to first demonstrate their economic value, prove themselves as worthy citizens.
He thought that pushing for political power too soon could be counterproductive,
Right.
right? And maybe even incite more violence and oppression.
Yeah. And given the context of the time, it's not hard to understand those concerns. The South was still reeling from the Civil War. White supremacy was deeply entrenched. Black people were being lynched. Their voting rights were being suppressed. Jim Crow laws were being enacted to maintain racial segregation.
It was a dangerous time to be outspoken about Black rights. And Washington was very aware of those dangers.
Yeah. But Dubois, he argued that political power was essential for dismantling those systems of oppression. He saw it as a way to challenge, the racist laws and policies that kept Black Americans marginalized.
So it's another example of their contrasting approaches. Dubois believed in direct confrontation with the system, while Washington believed in this more gradual approach,
Mhm.
focusing on building economic strength and proving their worth.
Right. And it's interesting to consider how those approaches played out, in the decades that followed. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s certainly embraced Dubois' call for direct action and political engagement. But there are also elements of Washington's philosophy there, like in the emphasis on Black economic empowerment
Mm.
and community self-reliance.
Right. It's not as if one approach was right and one was wrong.
Yeah.
It was a complex and evolving situation, and both of these men, both Dubois and Washington, were just trying to find the best path forward for their people.
Yeah. Really makes you appreciate just how nuanced history is, doesn't it? I mean, these weren't just abstract debates they were talking about. It was about real people's lives, their hopes, their fears, their struggles. And both Dubois and Washington, even with their differences, they were deeply committed to creating a better future for Black America.
Oh, absolutely. And that commitment really comes through in their writing. You can feel their passion,
Mhm.
their urgency, this deep yearning for a society where Black people could finally be free to live, thrive, reach their full potential.
And that yearning is, I mean, it's something that we still see today.
Right.
We're still grappling with so many of the same issues that Dubois and Washington were writing about over a century ago. It's
Yeah.
amazing, right? Like how much their words still resonate. Like when Dubois talks about that nameless prejudice that Black Americans face, that feeling of being judged and dismissed just because of the color of your skin. I mean, it's like he's describing something that's still happening.
It's heartbreaking, but it also shows how deeply ingrained these systems of oppression are,
Yeah.
how they've persisted across generations. It makes you wonder, how do we break these cycles? How do we create a society where everyone truly has an equal chance to succeed?
That's the question, isn't it?
Uh,
It's a question that requires a lot of soul searching,
Yeah.
individually and collectively. We need to acknowledge, the ways in which these systems still operate, even if they're not as overt as they were in the past. And we need to challenge those systems, speak out against injustice, and work toward creating a more equitable society.
Yeah, and Dubois, in his writing, he seemed to think that education, the pursuit of knowledge, that was key to breaking down those barriers. He really believed that by cultivating a sense of shared humanity, by understanding each other's stories and experiences, we could start to bridge the divides.
And Washington, I think, in his own way, he was also advocating for a kind of shared understanding.
Yeah.
He believed that, by demonstrating their economic value, Black Americans could earn the respect and the recognition of the white community.
But it wasn't about assimilation, though, right? It was about proving their worth on their own terms, while still maintaining their own distinct culture and identity.
Exactly. It was about carving out a space for themselves
Right.
within a society that often tried to erase them
Yeah.
or diminish their contributions.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive here, I think the big question to ask ourselves is what can we learn from these two men, from these extraordinary figures?
Yeah.
How can we take what they were saying, their insights, their wisdom, and apply it to the challenges we face today?
It's something we're thinking about for sure. Both Dubois and Washington, in their own ways, they challenged us to think critically about the systems that create inequality, to strive for a more just and compassionate world, and to never give up hope for a better future.
It's a powerful legacy they left behind, and it's one that I think we all have a responsibility to carry forward. Thanks for joining us on this journey back in time, and hopefully their words will inspire you as much as they've inspired us to navigate the complexities of our own era.